across the West, UK included, leaders are reeling at that news. We should point out that the announcement of his death came yesterday, which actually fell on the first day of the Munich Security Conference in Germany. Now, this is a big gathering of world leaders and foreign ministers to discuss defence matters, and as has been for the last 2 years, the conference is almost entirely focused on Russia and the invasion of Ukraine. So, look, I've spoken to a few people who do suspect, was this a statement released to coincide with that? We've certainly seen Putin do things similarly in recent years to make a statement. David Cameron has been speaking, as you said, this morning to reporters, and he has expressed the UK's outrage at Navalny's treatment. He's also said and strongly hinted that the UK and other G7 nations will respond to this. Now, whilst he hasn't said what that will entail, my understanding from speaking to people this morning is the UK is looking at whether further sanctions can be announced against individuals, presumably that the government believes is involved in his death. That will probably be quite senior officials in the Kremlin who they blame.
I mean, you wouldn't have thought that by now we had much left in the toolbox.
No, you're right. Although we've sanctioned a huge number of Russian individuals since the war began. I think it's about 1,200 in total. But there are some high-level Kremlin officials who have so far escaped sanction. And I certainly know that in the last few months, the UK was already gearing up to announce new sanctions relating to the war in Ukraine. They were preparing to announce those to coincide with the second anniversary, which falls next weekend. But I think we might see even more announced as a consequence of Navalny's death.
I mean, presumably European leaders and world leaders generally are very consumed at the moment by the prospect of Donald Trump becoming president, with his comments about NATO, with his sort of perceived closeness to Putin. This must sort of feed into sort of further anxieties in that regard.
Well, I think it does as well. And I think if you look at the conversation that's happening in America, the sense of return to isolationism, you only have to look at the Tucker Carlson interview that took place with Putin. You know,
he's still there, isn't he?
He's still, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, it took place days before this. And I think it does highlight to European leaders, certainly, and I think that's going to be a theme at this security conference over the weekend, about the need for other NATO members outside of America to really understand that if Trump comes back in as president, they are going to need to step up their commitments to NATO, because they cannot always rely on the American behemoth to police the West and to safeguard its interests. So that is also going to be a developing conversation, I think. And that's only going to grow as Trump continues his presidential election campaign. We're going to hear more, I think, from Trump on this issue about NATO members stepping up.
I'm sure we will. Well, look, turning to domestic matters, The Times is reporting that up to 20 Tory MPs privately believe that the party would be doing better under a new leader. How serious is that as a threat to Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think the fact that that report does not actually name the individuals, and the fact that none of them have actually put their names to that claim, suggests that the threat to Sunak, whilst I think it's there and growing, is still medium term to long term. I think the reality is that a few weeks ago, Sir Simon Clarke, a former cabinet minister, went over the top and called for Sunak to quit, and he was so badly mauled as a result that a lot of those would-be rebels who do probably feel that the PM needs to go, they just don't want to put their head above the parapet at this moment. There's also just a sense, I think, after these two by-elections, I mean, we shouldn't sugarcoat it. The Tories have just suffered their 8th consecutive by-election loss in this parliament. Sunak, unfortunately, now claims the mantle for the worst run in peacetime, beyond that suffered by John Major. So it's not good. But I think the reality is that a lot of those MPs, there's a sense of fatalism that's setting in. And that actually probably is more potent in the long term for Sunak. More than 60 Tory MPs, I think, now have announced that they intend to step down at the next election. It's a very high number, and the trajectory is going to be much higher, I think, based on current trends, than the number of Tory MPs who stepped down before the 1997 election, where Blair secured a crushing landslide victory. So I think, in terms of what's going to happen now, I think Sunak will kind of trundle along. A lot of the hope that now, I think, rests for the government in the upcoming budget on March the 6th. But again, even there, there was all this talk about big tax cuts before the election, big giveaways to the electorate, but the economic headwinds are also turning against Sunak. We've heard this week that the latest OBR figures given to Jeremy Hunt suggest his fiscal headroom has actually declined in the last few weeks, and he has less money to play with. So all of that hope about potential 2p off income tax or national insurance, they're also fading away. He might not be able to afford to do that. So it's very hard to see where the government comes from now. Where is the solution to this rot that's set in? So I think longer term, a lot of the MPs who are thinking about any sort of leadership challenge, they're going to be thinking about the local elections in May. I think that will be the moment of maximum danger for the Prime Minister. But on the counter side, you have to question the logic, given that that brings it even closer to a general election, of replacing the Prime Minister 6 months potentially before a national poll.
Yeah.
So the reality is it's a very, very gloomy period for the Tories, and however much their kind of spin operation wants to try and soften that, the reality is Tory MPs this weekend are very depressed by what they see.
What's the Nigel Farage angle here? Because I mean, Farage is increasingly hinting about a return to frontline politics with Reform UK after the party performed stronger than it has before at the by-election. But he also is simultaneously talking about whether he'd become a Conservative MP with that sort of colossal entitlement that only Nigel Farage seems capable of capturing. I mean, is this? Farage always talks like this. You know, his stint in the jungle was going to be the turning point, and he came third. You know, so there's always a lot more talk than there's reality. Nonetheless, you do get a sense that there are quite a lot of Conservatives who are sort of looking towards Nigel Farage, thinking maybe we do actually want a bit of that.
That is definitely true. There are definitely backbench MPs who think that Nigel Farage should not only return to the Conservative Party, there are some who think he would actually make a pretty good leader. Now, Nigel Farage is talking like a man where the world is his oyster right now. He has a situation where he's the honorary president of Reform, this fringe party which has now broken through the double-digit ceiling in the polls, and he's very happy with how they performed in those two by-elections. But as you say, I actually spoke to him yesterday for a piece that will be in the paper tomorrow, and he's still not committing either way to what he's going to do.
Do you think is that for real, or is that a ploy? Is that because he wants to sort of ride in on a white horse at exactly the right time, or is that because he genuinely doesn't know?
I wish I could give you a definitive answer on that. I genuinely don't know. I think the only person that does is him. I think he loves the publicity. He has always done. But I think he feels that building up this sense of momentum plays to his advantage. And to be honest, he probably is, if we're being cynical, is probably looking for the best opportunity open to him.
Yeah.
Because if this pressure becomes overwhelming for the Conservative Party, who knows what might happen? Who knows what offers might go in, what backroom conversations might go on? The other way of looking at it, of course, is that the more he destabilises the Conservative Party with the suggestion of his return, and the more that Conservative right-wingers talk about the need to shift to the right, to kind of hug Nigel Farage, to hug Reform, the more that plays actually to the benefit of Reform. And therefore he comes back, leads Reform to a sterling result in the general election, a bit like UKIP in 2015, and he'll be very pleased with that. So I don't know the answer, but all I know is that it's been a very bad week for Rishi Sunak, and it's been a very good week for Nigel Farage.
Turning to Labour, who had this sort of remarkable situation where they've had two storming by-election results, and yet are perceived by many to have had quite a bad week because they've had all the anti-Semitism stuff going on there. How worried do you think Keir Starmer is about all that there is just going to be a constant stream of like terrible Facebook posts and terrible things recorded in meetings and so on? Or is this just a hassle he has to put up with while he kind of rides to victory? What do you think?
I think it's the latter. I think there is going to be speed bumps along the way. I think what Sir Keir Starmer has done is he has done a very good job, at least optically, of sorting out the problems in the parliamentary party that Labour had under Jeremy Corbyn with anti-Semitism. I think what has happened in Rochdale and what's happened with the other candidate, Graham Jones, what that shows is that when you leave London and you go out into the regions and to the local parties, there is still that nasty undercurrent of anti-Semitism, and that still is quite pervasive, as it is actually. Unfortunately, we have to say, in society in Britain, that is a problem, and that's reflected in new statistics that were published this week by the Community Security Trust. I think from the conversations I've had this week with people in the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer is very frustrated that this incident happened. There's been a lot of criticism about and question marks about his decisiveness. Should they have acted sooner to get rid of that candidate? I think what he is determined to do now is to make sure that they don't repeat that mistake, to move on from this, to learn the lessons. But is he going to face similar in the run-up to election? I think it's inevitable that there'll be other candidates with similar views who are exposed by journalists. It's a matter of how his party and how his leadership team deals with that. That's what's going to be crucial.